Welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast, where we dig into matters local, national, and international with cool head and reasonable discussion to get to the heart of the matter. I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury. So here we are, cool heads and hearts at the heart of the matter, but not everything has been of late. There's been some quite emotional stuff or quite some confounding stuff that's been going on that we thought we'd need someone to help us make sense of. Luckily, we've got a political expert, a political consultant with many years of experience in the Republican Party in Florida. We have Jamie Miller to join us and help us kind of make sense of the events and the views from the other side of the Atlantic. Good evening, Jamie.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome. Thank you for coming along. Shall we get right into our first question?
I'm ready if you are.
Ready? Poised like a coiled zebra. Okay, so Jamie, if you don't mind, if you could introduce yourself and talk about how you got into politics and your links with the Florida Republican Party.
Yeah, I've been involved for about 30 years in Republican politics, mostly in Florida. I was a senior advisor to Newt Gingrich's presidential campaign in Florida in 2012. I was director of field operations for George W. Bush's presidential campaign in 2000 and the subsequent recount. That's always kind of an interesting topic of history at this point, but certainly was an interesting time to live through. I've worked on campaigns large and small. I've worked with a rural county to bond an emergency room, and I'm just as proud of that win as I was working with Newt Gingrich's presidential campaign, because it's all politics is local, as they say, and that particular emergency room saved hundreds of lives over the years just because of how far they would have to drive to get to a legitimate emergency room. So I got involved volunteering like a lot of people have in politics. I joined the Republican Party. At one point, I was the youngest county party chairman in Florida. And then I went on to become the executive director of the Republican Party of Florida. And, that's kind of my career. I consult on campaigns, both small and large. And, and I work with I live here in Sarasota, Florida. A lot of your friends and neighbors, I'm sure, come to visit us during the winter, and we're certainly glad to have you. And and I do a little bit of government relations or public affairs locally.
Brilliant. And I think it'd be fair to say you've got your own YouTube channel.
We do. It's called Reasonable Arguments. It's a Substack, and me and my wife have a podcast called Reasonable Arguments. And my wife's not political at all, so it's kind of the layman's take with the expert view, but tried to explain it so everybody can understand it. If you're fancy yourself a political connoisseur, you certainly will enjoy it. But if you know very little about politics, you'll tend to enjoy it as well.
Oh, fabulous. It feels like you're going to be very welcome on our podcast, as Simon and I have been doing this for 5 years, knowing very little about politics ourselves and trying to educate. So if we dig into kind of recent history in the US, obviously most commentators inside and outside the US seem to believe that President Trump would not win the last election. Obviously, give us an insight into why the majority got it so wrong, and what was it about Trump's campaign that got him over the line?
So there were two things. I always say that sometimes in political consulting, I make my guy win, or I make the other guy lose. And in this case, Donald Trump employed a strategy where he won, and in this case, lady lost. So she did not have very much of a message that resonated with especially voters in swing states, or the voters that mattered in swing states. And Donald Trump, I think they expected Donald Trump to implode his campaign to implode. But one of the things that he did differently this year, and she doesn't get very much credit, and not very many people ever hear about her, but I worked with her on Governor Rick Scott's campaign, and she's the current White House chief of staff. Is Susie Wiles was in charge and the campaign manager for Donald Trump. And the one thing that she brings to a campaign that may have been lacking in his campaign in 2020 is discipline. And then also, especially after the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania in July, there is a difference in Donald Trump where I like to simplify it by saying in the past, he practiced the politics of subtraction. And especially after that assassination attempt, he started practicing the politics of addition. And I think that made a big difference in the campaign all the way from July to November.
So just on that, Jamie, subtraction versus addition, can you just unpack that a bit for our listeners?
Well, yeah, it's a pretty simple way of looking at it. But if you look at his first presidential campaign, especially where, Marco Rubio ran against him, and he was persona non grata. And you could go from person after person who was persona non grata in the White House if they turned on President Trump versus, and so that, I think that is the catalyst of his loss in 2020. And then he made this pivot in 2024. So you include people like Tulsi Gabbard and Elon Musk and Marco Rubio. And he just, instead of Vivek Ramaswamy, who ran against him for president, those were people in 2016 who would have been sliced out of his orbit. And instead, he welcomed them with open arms, and he said, "Hey, listen, let's." Robert F. Kennedy is a perfect example of saying, "Hey, let's build the team bigger. And if you want to be on the team, I want you on the team." Versus, "Hey, we had a disagreement, and you're out," which I think was how his first term would be defined, and his second term seems to be more welcoming.
Yeah, and so forgive me if we ask some questions that might seem a bit simplistic, but I guess we see a perspective in the UK that sometimes is perhaps very different to what people see in the US. I guess most people would have characterized Trump as being very personally insular, kind of very much somebody who sort of plows his own furrow and kind of bounces about, you know, basically following an agenda that's very personal to him. I guess the picture you're painting there, Jamie, is perhaps something that's, and I'm almost afraid to use the word inclusive, but it suggests that you were seeing something kind of more inclusive that perhaps the American people were seeing as well.
I think maybe the right way to look at it would be he's certainly more inclusive than he was in his first term.
Mm.
And that's we could probably debate the entire podcast on what that
Yeah.
means, but
Yep.
but I certainly think that is the case.
And
There's a lot less family members involved in this administration than there were in the first term. Do you think that's
I haven't really
difference?
thought about that. I don't know that it's. I think he's relying on people he trusts. And in that first term, the people he trusted were family, were more family members. And he's, like I said, he's expanded that group of people, which is, quite frankly, not easy for a politician or a former president to do.
And I guess if we look at the perhaps the other side, and this is you perhaps being more objective as looking across at the other party, do you think they were damaged by perhaps Joe Biden trying to hang on too long and then Kamala having to come in and try and create a new narrative?
No, I don't think it was that at all. They were damaged by Joe Biden's policies and his failure to recognize that his policies were damaging the American economy and then pivot to a more successful plan. And so Kamala Harris, anybody who was running in 2024 on the Democratic side was going to have to embrace those policies that the American people they were rejecting those policies.
Interesting. I think we'll pick that up on one of our later questions as well.
Yeah, that sounds like a thing. So, I mean, what would you say the differences are between I mean, that's obviously talking about how we got back into office. I mean, we've touched on it a bit there. How are the differences of this administration versus the first administration? How are they being viewed at home?
Well, I think it's important. I think it's
Hmm.
important to understand that we're 50 to 60 days into this first
Yeah,
administration. So it's in its
yeah.
infancy, even though I think most people sort of look at this as his second
Mm.
term, and he's going to be limited to just 4 years in office. He is ineligible to run for another term. And so there's kind of it depends on how you want to view it, but he's certainly just in 60 days, and he's a disruptor. There's no question about that, and he wants to make sure that that he is putting Americans at the forefront of his decisions.
I mean, it's probably fair to say that rather than just kind of saying they kind of hit the ground running from day one, they were literally out the gate from minute one, weren't they? It was just a constant stream of policy, executive orders, and actions literally right after the inauguration. They weren't hanging around.
It, when you're living in history, it's hard to reflect upon
Mm.
it. And I learned that during the 2000 recount. And it'll be interesting to see what people say about this particular first 90 or 100 days of Donald Trump's second term, let's say 10 years from now, because it certainly is, if he goes on to have a successful second term, it is this foundation that he's laying that will propel him to that successful second term. But if the economy tanks and it's seen as due to his policies, then it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So I don't know that I answered your question. If I didn't, remind me, ask it again.
No, I think the overarching response you're giving is it's too early days to kind of really gauge that, and you only really get that from a reflection of history.
Yeah, that's a very nice. You took my jumbled words and made it sound very nice. Thank you.
Would you say, just looking at that Trump one versus
No,
Trump two, Jamie, that it feels like there's, because sometimes we touch on it, it feels like there's more of a sense of urgency.
Yes, and I think that what will be interesting to see is to see if Democrats look back on the 2020 election and wish he had won that, because I don't know that you would have seen this level of disruption, like you said, Ian, that he had 4 years to think about these executive orders that he was going to sign and roll, and really plan based upon what he felt were either roadblocks or failures in his first term. So he had 4 years to kind of sit on the bench and plan this out. And so I think he's doing exactly what he wants to do, what he had planned on doing. I think it's very calculated. And, not that there haven't been a few, let's say, variables that have, like Ukraine and some of those sorts of things that are variables. But I think as far as domestic policy, he's enacting exactly what he planned.
And I think that's an area, Jamie, where in the UK, it is one of the things that perhaps passes us by is the kind of the US domestic agenda. And when we start looking at it through a kind of fiscal lens, we touched on it when we were having a chat about this podcast. America appears to be going, a couple of trillion into debt further every year.
Mhm.
I guess how is that? How is that? Felt, experienced by the American people, and how much of a bearing do you think that had on their decision to kind of support Trump in his second term?
I don't know that the debt I'd like annual deficits or how much you're going in debt per year and the total
Yep.
debt. I would like to just make sure that I'm defining those two words correctly for your audience. But I don't know that people voted on the debt. People tend to vote on, and sometimes I like to say voters are smart, but sometimes they don't know why. And in this case, I think they knew that they were better off during Trump's first term. And I don't know that they said, oh, it was because of energy policy or because of foreign policy or any number of things. I think but they knew in their gut that things were better, and they were going to go with the person who they felt was did the better job. And I also think that the 2024 election pivoted a little bit on what we used to call affirmative action. Now it's termed DEI. And we are, and quite frankly, Kamala Harris was sort of the first DEI vice president. Joe Biden said that he was only going to consider African American women for vice president, and then he chose one. And then he really didn't trust her with much to build her credibility with the American people on her own. The one big thing that she had, which was a complete failure, was securing the southern border, as we know, and we know that that was something that Americans wanted to see, that the southern, millions of people per year coming across illegally and not knowing who they are, what they're bringing, and then we had 300,000 unaccompanied children that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security said that were lost. 300,000 unaccompanied minors that came across the southern border that the United States could not account for. And Joe Biden's own Department of Homeland Security said they were likely either dead, enslaved at child labor camps, or being sex trafficked. And, so Americans were like, how is this, how did things get so off that we're just allowing people to pour over the southern border by the millions per year? Estimates are somewhere 10 to 20 million during Joe Biden's 4 years alone illegally. That's on top of the 1.1 million legal immigrants we allow into our country every year. So, you're looking at somewhere between 3 to 5 million illegal per year.
And I guess if we focus on that, Jamie, then if we look back, and it's perhaps one of the boldest claims in that first term. President Trump was going to build a wall and was going to make Mexico pay for it, and so I guess that wasn't a new problem. And it draws parallels with the UK. The UK, there's a lot of our politics at the moment is discussing the amount of people that come across the English Channel in boats. So, I guess, it was high on President Trump's agenda first time round. Obviously, we know the wall didn't get built. Is that an insoluble problem for whatever the administration is?
Well, we know now that we maybe don't need a wall. We just need to stop accepting people across the southern border. We went from a couple 100,000 people per month crossing the southern border to, I believe last month was 9,000. A reduction of 90% just by saying, you're not welcome. You're not welcome to come this way. And which was just the opposite of what Joe Biden said. Joe Biden said, come. In fact, he was even worse than that. He said, send your children. And then once the children are established, then they can, they have a sponsor, they get a sponsor, and then the sponsor can apply for the parents to come. And so then the parents come and actually get a green card because the children are here. So Joe Biden was having parents send their children to the southern border to deal with cartels. And you have to realize the Mexican drug cartels completely control south of the U.S. border with the border of Mexico, 100%. Nobody crosses that border without paying cartels. Nobody. And if you don't have the money, you either get killed or you get kidnapped, and your family members from wherever you are have to come up with the money to pay for your transit across to the U.S. border. And so it's very dangerous. So much so, and these things aren't talked about very much, so much so that mothers who send their daughters across the border send them with the day after pill. because they know they're going to get raped along the way. They know that they're going to be abused along the way. And yet they send them anyway just to try to get them into America so they can then apply for asylum for the parents and other family members. And that's another little kind of unknown fact with immigrants. You know, for every immigrant who comes to the United States over the next 4 to 10 years, it is represents about 12 people. So every 1 million people that we allow in legally over the next 10 years, another 10 to 12 million come, because every immigrant represents, they bring family members in through legal channels. And so it becomes this huge multiplying factor that, we just cannot, we cannot sustain. If you go through America and we start talking about worker housing, in towns like Sarasota, we've dealt with it a lot because we're a beach town, we're a tourist town. A lot of people retire here, so housing is always kind of tough. But when you start talking about little places like Arcadia, Florida, or the middle of Georgia, the names of little towns that you wouldn't even know, who are having affordable housing, are having an affordable housing crisis. Part of that is because of the number of illegal immigrants we've allowed into our country and have established themselves in these small towns all across America. And they're using the affordable housing, and so there's not housing for workers.
So again, which brings us back to the question, I guess, was about kind of the fiscal impact of overspending and the economy. So, and again, so do you see the kind of issue of illegal immigration? Is it a case of that Americans are seeing it through a lens of the impact that has economically? Obviously, the juxtaposition of diversity, equity, and inclusion and legal immigration tends to lean people much more towards perhaps more sinister thinking behind as to what's behind that. How do you think the ordinary American is kind of joining those dots?
Yeah, I think it's two-pronged. It's that and foreign aid. The United States is currently $36 trillion in debt. 36 trillion. It's hard to believe. Our annual budget is just six. So if we didn't spend a dime on anything for 6 years, we would still, by the time you include the interest, it would take us 7 years of not spending any money on Social Security, infrastructure, Medicare, anything to pay off our debt. And we have an annual operating deficit of $1.7 trillion per year. Our deficit is the budget of France. And so, and it's more than the budget of the United Kingdom. And so, it's something that we have to, as Americans, have said, we elected a president to get some of this back within the guardrails of common sense. We can no longer afford to have, illegal immigrants come just across the border and then them automatically be eligible for Social Security, for instance. Or we can no longer afford all these USAID programs to the tune of billions of dollars. And, and if you compare that to, our annual debt our debt to budget ratio is 127%. The United Kingdom is a little bit below at like 13%. But, France is at 9.6. Germany only runs a 4.9% deficit, annual deficit. Brazil is 2.6. So, Americans are starting to feel like through all these foreign aid programs, whether that's illegal immigrants coming across the border or actual foreign aid, that we're financing things in the world that our allies aren't willing to finance themselves. Because, they're like, oh, it's okay for America to go in debt, but we're not willing to go in debt ourselves for the very same things. And I think that's kind of the line in the sand that Donald Trump has drawn, is that, we're not going to leave people behind. And that's what I'm concerned about is that, that people in Europe and the United Kingdom feel like America is saying, no, we're going to leave you behind. And the truth is, I don't believe we will. But the truth of the matter is, we are going to have an America first policy, but I do not believe it's an America only policy. But we're going to have to prioritize how we spend the money that does go to foreign countries.
And we've got a question on that, I think later in our list. But I think
No, I'm sorry for
no, no,
jumping
no,
ahead.
no, no. To be fair, these things are fluid. But I think
No,
Simon,
that's
you've
all
got the
right.
next question
We
on the
we
economy.
we can duck and dive. Yeah. So as someone famously once said, it's about the economy, stupid. So that kind of seems to be a lot of the theme of what you're talking about there, Jamie, and kind of what's really hitting home behind the decisions. So, given the state of the economy and the kind of on off kind of situation with tariffs and how the stock market has reacted to that, the impacts possibly of inflation of those as a conservative, what's your view about the tariff kind of the tariff? I don't want to use the word war, but the tariff.
Let's just say right now. Right now, I think it's a situation.
I don't even conflict sounds a bit. The tariff situation. It's my favorite word. It's a beautiful word, but what's your view on the tariff situation?
Yeah, I think it's a situation for sure. I think Americans have kind of, are waking up to the tune. This is not something that is ingrained in, the average American, is how much they're paying in tariffs or how much another country is putting a tariff on our products. We pretty much are like live and let live. If I can go to the grocery store and get what I want, we're fine. As long as, whatever, I'm going down to the factory to work and somebody's buying those products somewhere, and it's all good. And so, what we're seeing is, and what Donald Trump has kind of shined a light on, is that, certainly most countries look at it by industry, steel, milk, different commodities. And you start looking at, well, they have these huge tariffs on American products. And Donald Trump has said, we're going to have reciprocal tariffs. If you are going to put a 10 or 20 or 50% tariff on our products, we're going to put a 10, 20, or 50% tariff on yours. If you want no tariffs with the United States, just drop yours to zero. And I don't know if that's good or bad, or great economic policy or international policy or not. We could certainly have that debate. I would probably learn from you more than I could explain to you on that. But I think that Americans see that as a fair way of trying to get this balance back. And I do think it does come back to the amount of money we are in debt, the amount of money that we're going in debt every year. And, and Americans feel like other people in the world that we feel like we've done a lot for don't appreciate it. And we're the ones going in debt for it. And so I think that's maybe the answer to your tariff question. As far as the stock market goes, the stock market is 200 points higher than it was the day before the election. Now, that's not saying much, but certainly the way that it's being portrayed in the press is that we've had this huge dip in the stock market. It's catastrophic. And the truth of the matter is, on November 4th, the stock market was at about 41,700, and it closed Friday at 41,900. And so while it went up after the election, it's now kind of settled back down. That's not unusual for the United States stock market, for the Dow Jones Industrial, to do that after an election, or, depending on if it's a surprise one way or the other. Sometimes it will go down after a presidential election, but usually within 3 or 4 months, it's back to equilibrium, which is where it's at today. So I don't know that tariffs have had a long-term impact on, or the threat of tariffs have had a long-term impact on the U.S. economy. Many of these tariffs don't actually take place until April 2nd. So we'll see what type of long-term impacts they have on both the world economies and the U.S. economy as well.
Yeah, I guess our experience as a country that voted to, as some would describe it, voted to put sanctions on itself with its nearest trading partner with the B word. It hasn't been the end of the world, but it also hasn't kind of helped, because our economies always function on a just-in-time delivery system, and they're very, very well integrated, and lots of things that are even made in one country have constituent parts that come from other countries. So it
Sure.
kind of has knock-on and effects and unintended consequences. It kind of sounds like what you're saying is that there's a lot of American perception that, and I'm paraphrasing you, so forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, is that there's a lot of a feeling that the American public have been taken advantage of. Is that kind of how would you say that's a fair kind of impression of how the
Yeah, I think that's close, where people feel like we are leveraging our
Mm,
grandchildren's future to support other countries. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it. It just needs to be put in perspective. And I think that is what is truly happening. And, that's one reason why I so appreciate being on your show. I know that when we spoke prior to the show, you all seemed surprised that America was this
mm,
percentage in debt compared to other countries. And and I think it is surprising. And I think Americans are kind of surprised. I mean, we know we're in debt. We know that we run a deficit every year. I don't know that many Americans sit there and stew about it. We still have a great economy. We have, somebody describes it as like, well, you have to look at all of our assets, our national parks, our interstate system, all of these assets that we've paid for over the years, you know. And so when you look at it that way, are we truly in debt? And I'm like, yes, we are. The truth of the matter is we have to manage this debt, because the debt has to be managed with
mm.
cash flow. The debt's not managed with infrastructure or national parks.
Yeah,
And
and yeah, unless
and
you're selling your
so you
national
have to
assets,
raise you have to
you're
raise taxes to pay this debt.
yeah. Sorry to interrupt you there. I guess lots of countries running a deficit, and lots of countries are in debt. Obviously, different ones to different degrees. But I think I think that's the age old kind of difference between a conservative approach to finances and a I'll call it left wing approach to finances, of the difference between whether you aim to spend more money than you earn in the sense of tax receipts or not. And we could fill another podcast in trying to discuss are there other ways of getting more tax receipts than there's I guess there's two ways of ending up with more money left at the end of the month, aren't there? There's either earn more or spend less, right?
I don't know if all in all that having debt or even a deficit, an annual deficit, is 100%
Mm.
horrible. Most families run both a
Yeah.
deficit
Mm.
and debt, with their mortgage. So, but it's
Yeah.
manageable. And ours is getting to a point where, when you run a $2.2 trillion deficit every year, 1 trillion of that is just to
Servicing the
manage the
debt. Yeah.
debt. So it's where the United States is at a
Mm.
tipping point where, 5 years from now, if we continue on this trajectory, we are not going to forget about managing, being able to help other countries in the
Mm.
world. We simply will not be able to, because we'll just have too much debt to
Yeah.
manage. And, so to have a president who is looking forward and looking, past his own 4 years and saying one of the things we must do is get the debt in check, is to me refreshing. It doesn't mean that we cut off all ties to, it's not that we're cutting off all ties to every country. It's just that we have to look at what we are spending our money on, how efficient is it, and, quite frankly, is it appreciated by those who we're giving it to?
Which is the perfect segue, Jamie, into our next question on international relations. So I guess from our perspective here, it does feel that the US foreign policy has changed. And I think some of it we understand, some of it we don't. It does feel a little bit like Trump has turned his back on Europe and Ukraine. Obviously we've spoken about Mexico, and we touched on, tariffs with Canada and some of the challenges that's brought, and some really kind of rather alarming plans sort of mooted about Greenland, Panama, and even Canada itself as to whether I don't know what phrase you want to use. I mean, how do you see this change in international relations? I think you've given us the financial perspective, but I guess what
Yeah, I
part of
think
the question, I guess,
I,
is 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 part of MAGA, Make America Great Again. Is it kind of more isolationist?
no, I don't think so. I think it is make America first policy, but not America only. And I think that's different
Hmm.
than isolationist. And so, when it comes to Greenland, we know this president has a special knack for political rhetoric.
Oh yeah.
That's
And whether he,
that is understatement of the century. But bless you, that's a lovely way of phrasing it.
well, thank you. I get an
Yep, yep.
award. And not only did I not get kicked off your show, I get an award as
Yeah, that
understatement
is
of the
Yep.
century.
okay.
Um,
He definitely has a skill for
but
rhetoric. That's absolutely certain. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
has a skill for rhetoric. And so some of the things that he speaks about, I think he believes it in
Mhm.
the moment, but it's kind of like I look at it as if I remember the family and we're talking around Thanksgiving dinner. And you come up with some crazy ideas around Thanksgiving dinner, and he just happens to say that to the press. And so, does he believe that Greenland should be a state or Canada should be a state? Sure. But does he truly believe that they will become a state? He wants to get what he wants to get, but the practical application is that's not likely to happen. And so, in 1948, President Truman tried to buy Greenland for the exact same reason as President Trump suggested that we buy it. So this is not a new theory in American politics. It's not something that's discussed
Oh, okay.
regularly or in
Yeah.
history books or things like that, but it's not like Donald Trump picked it out of the blue. I mean, I think also saying Canada will become the 51st state is, I think, a little bit as much political rhetoric towards the former Canadian Prime Minister as much as anything else. But does that mean that Donald Trump has a a foreign policy of expansion? I don't think so. I think it's more, one of the differences, if we can go back to one of the difference I like to explain to people about Donald Trump 2016, 20, and 24, and I apply it to the two campaigns. In 2020, especially 2020, Americans kind of got tired of Donald Trump setting fires. And they didn't like his tweets, they didn't like his kind of the rhetoric that you guys are talking about, and they didn't like it. And so but fast forward to 2024, Americans pivoted to saying, you know what, those 4 years of Donald Trump, that first term, he led us through fire. Now he said a bunch, but he led us through. And so in 2024, Americans elected Donald Trump to lead us through fires, despite the fires he sets. And I think some of the things you're talking about with
Mhm.
Canada or Greenland are, quote, the fires that he sets. And so is he going to lead us through? Sure, he's going to lead us through. Does that mean that Canada and Greenland are going to become united, members, states within the
Mhm.
United States? Probably not. But does it mean that Greenland may accept a little bit greater United States presence because they become such an important piece of, like I like to say, political dirt from a foreign policy perspective? They may. And so, and if that happens, that's probably a big win for Donald Trump.
So do you think it's
So
more, you use the example of kind of, the family around the Thanksgiving dinner? Do you think it's more that he just doesn't have a filter at all, rather than some sort of Machiavellian kind of plan and strategy? Is it just that he?
I wouldn't go so far as to say he doesn't have a
Mhm.
filter at all, because I think he's more calculating and more strategic than that, and more disciplined than that. I think he I think he plays into that. I think he gets away with some of it because people think, oh, he doesn't have a
Yeah,
filter. This is just Donald Trump being Donald Trump. But but then months have gone by and Donald Trump is still like, hey, I'd like to make Greenland a state. So there's no question that he thinks that he'd like to do that. But I always like to say, the practical application of these things is, often much more difficult than, snapping your fingers and making good things
yeah.
happen.
Okay. Well, as I guess that as long as the Canadians don't have to worry about you sending in special forces just yet, that's the, that's
Yeah, I don't see a United States military takeover of either of those places to expand
yeah.
United States territory.
No, no. And I guess we'd be remiss, Jamie, if we didn't ask you, because as I say, some of the stuff we kind of understand, and if we look at the sort of Russia, Ukraine, Europe dynamic at the moment, the fact is that for a long time, America has had an awful lot of troops and boots on the ground in Europe. And it would be fair to say, and I think most recognise that some European economies kind of freewheeled a little bit on defence spending because, we had a big brother who, if you picked on us, was going to come in and sort that out. But I guess what kind of worries Europeans is, and again, I think a lot of us find very perplexing, is that Russia has annexed twice chunks of Ukraine. And the history of American Russian relations has never been, since the Second World War, it's been ideologically opposed to each other. But it looks from the outside, from our perspective here, that there is more warmth towards Russia than we would expect. Um, but I guess the other angle to take is, you know, have recent events been all about the transactional nature of kind of Donald Trump's foreign policy and getting a deal with Ukraine and kind of getting the war to end through that mechanism? How do you perceive that, and how do ordinary Americans see the Trump-Putin relationship?
Yeah, it depends probably on which political party you are in the United States.
Mm,
And if you're a Republican, you think Donald Trump is doing a great job, and if you're a Democrat, you think he's sold the soul of America to Vladimir Putin. And so uh, my personal belief, and I think the practical application again of these things, none of this happens in a vacuum.
mm,
And the one thing I think the world cannot allow is for Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China to ally themselves in a worldwide expansion.
yeah.
And so, we already know that North Korea has sent at least 10,000 troops in October to the Russia-Ukraine war. And that should be a chilling effect for everybody. And I don't know if they've sent more since then, but they certainly sent 10,000 in there. The other practical application, and I don't like it, but the other practical application is I don't know that there's enough boots on the ground that we can put in Ukraine to shove Russia out of the ground that they've taken. And so the question becomes, what do you want to do to um, to stop Russia from taking more? And do you want to threaten World War III and potentially hundreds of thousands of Allied lives to move Russia back? And knowing that if you take that, these things aren't going to happen in a vacuum. And North
Mm,
Korea has already shown that they're willing to put men on the ground. And if the world's allies against Russia decided to do that, you can probably count that North Korea and at least North Korean army would put more boots on the ground, so Russia could keep that ground. And so we're in this dangerous, I don't even want to call it a game because it's not a game, but a
Mm.
game of chicken of, what is the deal that can be made that is brings peace to Europe, that is most equitable? Is it Russia keeping that land? That's not necessarily equitable, but is it equitable when you think of the number of lives it would take to get that land back if we were going to do it through war? And I can tell you, Americans are not keen or even willing to consider
Mm.
putting American boots on the ground to do that. And so I think that is pretty bipartisan. And for anything to be bipartisan in America today is a pretty strong factor. And so then the question becomes, how do you balance what Russia is doing, what China is doing around the world,
Mm.
and we know that Iran has sent drones and other military equipment to Russia. So this is not just an easy black and white, there's a line in the sand and we need them to go back over this line and that's the way it is. Because if they don't want to get pushed back, what is your willingness to put your children and grandchildren at stake to push Russia out of Ukraine? I don't want my children and grandchildren in that fight.
No, and I think that makes absolute sense, Jamie. I think it's that bigger world stage, isn't it? Where I think there was a vote in the UN a few weeks ago where, America voted with Russia, Korea, Iran, and China kind of against Ukraine. And I think for many people that was just something that I think we couldn't countenance simply because many of us still believe that the Iranian and the Chinese position with regards to the US is and even Russia perhaps they're varying shades of hostile, but they're not, they've never been allies and they almost certainly never will be.
Yeah, and history as a guide, if you take those four countries and there is a world war, as much as I hate to say it, during the last two world wars, Russia was on our side.
Yep.
And so if you use history as a guide, the person you want to try to keep your enemies, your friends close and your enemies closer. And I'm not, Donald Trump wants peace. And
Yep.
he has made, I don't believe that's political rhetoric at all. I think that he has said he wants peace. He wants peace. The whole thing with Zelensky kind of threw Americans off guard a little bit, simply because, and I'll go back to it. Zelensky, when he blew the minerals deal up, said something like, I don't want my grandchildren going in debt over this war. And I can tell you a lot of Americans were offended by that. When you want my grandchildren to go in debt over your war and to protect you, but you're not willing to make a minerals deal that maybe doesn't, but may put your grandchildren in debt. Like that to me was offensive. And I thought Zelensky lost a lot of people in the United States when he made some comments like that. And I think they've tried to patch it up, and Donald Trump is in this precarious position of, like, I want you guys to stop shooting each other, and we don't want more people to die there. But how do you come to a resolution? I don't know what the resolution is.
No.
How do you come? I think the important thing here is that I think Donald Trump sees things as it's not one thing and one thing only. That none of this happens in a vacuum. That every time you push on Russia, yes, he gets pushed back from, if he helps Russia a little bit, he gets pushed back from Europe. If he helps Ukraine a little bit, then
No.
he gets pushed back from North Korea and China. And so we're in this we're in this seesaw of where's the balance. And I'm not sure we as the world have figured out that balance yet. And it's a little harder when some people in the world don't think that there needs to be a balance, or don't see that, hey, this is not just a Russia-Ukraine issue. These decisions are going to have global impacts.
I guess there's a couple of, so there's competing problems, isn't there? And they're all kind of intertwined. On one hand, we've seen from the last 10 years that if Russia doesn't, and forgive the language here, doesn't see consequences, quote unquote, to it annexing land from other countries, it's just going to keep, there's nothing in its interest to make it stop, continue to do that. And we've seen how that kind of works out in history before. But on the other hand, I'm just kind of thinking of the comments both from Vice President JD Vance and from your Secretary of Defense. Sorry, I forgot his first name, Hegseth. About focusing in kind of turning the Americas' focus to Asia. I'm just wondering, actually, is actually part of the theory here about if there's no way back for Russia to, quote unquote, rejoin the peaceful politics, then we're just driving them further into the arms of China and North Korea, and cementing that union as an opposing axis, which at some point is basically just putting more powerful and culturally very different countries to us in an opposing axis to us. Is that kind of the thinking of, you think, maybe, of what's kind of going on? As you say, it's not one simple thing.
Yeah, I don't try to pretend to be a foreign policy expert, and I certainly don't want to speak for American foreign policy. But but my perception is that that is what's going on. Is that, that those who are in charge of American foreign policy are looking at all of these things and how they impact. That you cannot just go make a deal with Russia and completely turn your back on Ukraine and the rest of Europe. And yet you can't completely go make a deal with Ukraine and, and have Russia, like you suggested, turn towards, China and North Korea. So it's not a great spot for any of us to be in.
No.
And, so I think President Trump, is committed to peace. He's trying to make that happen. He ran on bringing peace and ending that war. And I certainly hope that, cooler heads prevail. It seems like after things kind of got heated up, they did calm back down, and that's always a good thing. And that's hopefully where we are today. And it seems like late last week, and movement was happening with both Ukraine and Russia to and the United States to kind of barter a ceasefire at the very least. But I don't know that we're there yet.
Yeah, it's as you said, it's not simple, and it's not a good versus awful answer. I think all of the options are difficult and awful. So turning,
but all parties have to agree that they want peace, and if we're not starting with that premise, if Russia doesn't care about peace, then we have a different problem on our hands.
You can't make reasonable arguments with unreasonable people, can you?
Right. Yeah. So
which I guess leads us to our last question, Jamie, which is a bit more positive. So if we look at the next few years ahead, what are your hopes for America, its people, and its standing in the world? And then we'll be a little bit playful, because who wants to predict 3 years out? How do you see American politics evolving over the next few years and into 2028?
Yeah, I think we're, Americans are going to continue. I think this is important for people in other countries to hear. Americans are continue to participate in the world. Like, this is not an isolationist. We're not building walls all around. We are going to stop people from illegally crossing our southern border. We are going to have some policies that are Americans first. And I think part of that is already about the debt, So, what are my hopes? I have granddaughters who are 10, 6, and one on the way in May. So, you always hope for the best and want economic prosperity and peace. And I think that we can have that. We had that under Donald Trump's first term, and I think we'll have it again. I tend to be optimistic about these things. As you can see, I have Ronald Reagan on the wall behind me, and I'm pretty nostalgic about that time period and his leadership. And I feel like we are, the best can still be ahead for all of us, and that is, we have our challenges here domestically. Certainly, Democrats and Republicans are probably as divided as ever, but I always say we're not as divided as we have been. We're not shooting each other. We had a civil war, and certainly the 40 years after that civil war, our country was very divided until prior to or about World War One. We were pretty divided politically. And so this is not unusual. And the other thing that's not unusual that some of your listeners might find interesting is it's not unusual to have 6 to 8 states separated by about 20,000 votes. Harry Truman won his race, I think it was 1948, in 6 states by about 22,000 votes. George W. Bush in 2000. There were 7 states that were separated by about 24,000 votes. And so, when you start, America has gone through these periods of being, pretty politically divided. And yet, when we need to, we come together and either help those in need or protect, our own interests, depending on the particular instance. So I would expect everybody to when the chips are down, we're going to be there. We always have been. We're going to continue to be there. And, does that mean we're going to fight about it along the way? Well, heck yeah, we're going to fight about it along the way. That's what we do. And so we're going
Welcome to democracy.
Absolutely, Jamie. And exactly this whole podcast has always been based on an initial fight between Simon and myself. So thank you ever so much for giving us your time this evening, and I'm sure we'll have you back on again, because we definitely need some more insights into America from a real life perspective rather than what we just read over here on the other side of the pond.
well, I'm happy to have joined you, and thank you so much for having me. Hopefully it was helpful.
Very much
Thank
indeed.
you, Jamie.
Thank you very much, Jamie.
So you've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And our guest this evening has been Jamie Miller from Florida.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. And I've been Simon Sansbury. Do join us next time. Follow us on Facebook and subscribe to us on YouTube to make sure you know about when our next show is. We'll have some news later on about a live show. Hopefully, we're trying to organise for in the middle of the week for the financial statement that coming from Rachel Reeves. We've got an inspiring entrepreneur, a disruptive entrepreneur by his own description, to talk to us about growth and about finance. So it'd be lovely to hear what Philip Ullman has to say about the Chancellor's financial statement. So join us next time on the Pompey Politics Podcast. Don't forget to like, follow and comment on Facebook, or comment and subscribe on YouTube. Find us on all the social media platforms: Facebook, X, YouTube, Threads, LinkedIn.